So we are moving on to our third panel, which is the sort of macro level factors, if you will. So we're going to start off with Alys Weinbaum, who is an associate professor of English here at the university. She's also part of the Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, as well as the comparative history of ideas. And then our second speaker will be Joanna Crane, who is an assistant professor of interdisciplinary arts and sciences at UW-Basel. And she directs the science, technology, and society major, and is affiliated with our anthropology department. And our third speaker will be Hetty Lee, who is associate professor, soon to be full professor in sociology. So we'll start with Alys.
Hi, everybody. Let me grab my drink. I'm struggling with a little throat thing, so I'll take a sip now and then. I just wanted to thank those who invited me to be part of the a microphone problem. How's that?
Sure.
Okay. I just wanted to thank those that invited me to be part of this conversation. I think these interdisciplinary conversations are so important. But I do want to start by stressing that from my perspective, this is a truly interdisciplinary exchange. It's not escaped my attention that I am the only participant that's officially in the humanities that's presenting today, and therefore I think I am coming from quite a different place. What I'm going to talk about today is this book that I've just completed writing. I'm going to be giving a pretty broad overview of some of the central ideas in it. It's the same as the title of the talk. It's called The Afterlife of Slavery, Human Reproduction in Biocapitalism. And what I was thinking might be most useful for this occasion is to highlight what a humanist, in my case, a literary scholar, a cultural studies scholar, a feminist scholar, a Marxist scholar, a Black studies scholar, what a humanist can add to a conversation on race and health justice, specifically as it relates to the ways in which we produce knowledge about reproductive cultures and reproductive politics, and therefore about what counts as reproductive freedom and racial justice and the intersection of those two things. I think, as it will be immediately self-evident, my work is neither positivist nor in any way empirical. It's not directly oriented towards amassing or analyzing data, towards making policy, towards improving the provision of services or the allocation of resources, or even towards contributing directly to conversations that might be thought to be most akin, those in bioethics or biomedical ethics. And so I'm very humbled to be part of a conversation that includes all of those things. This said, it is my hope that my work can be impactful in all of these conversations if it's taken up as a provocation and set to work, made use of, by those interested in crossing the disciplinary divides that might be most challenging to us. I was just yesterday morning teaching in my undergraduate course on Black feminism, Audre Lorde, and I came across this quote which feels really relevant in the present context, and I didn't have the text with me, so I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but it goes something like, meeting across difference always requires mutual stretching. And until we hear each other, and I think she says, until you hear me as a Black lesbian feminist, but until we hear each other in this context, our strengths will not be truly available to each other. So what I study in my work is what I would call the modern episteme, or more specifically, the slave episteme. This is my name for the historically entrenched thought system that informs and enables, or to put it more succinctly, subtends contemporary reproductive practices in the context of their global commodification, the creation of global markets around reproductive practices, technologies, commodities. So the question that my work begins with is pretty straightforward, I think. What makes it possible to offer for sale reproductive labor? What makes it possible in the form of surrogacy, for example, or even to offer reproductive products, eggs, babies, stem cells, blood, cord blood, all of those things. What makes it possible? And if we extend that thinking, what makes it possible to put body parts up for sale and organs on the market? How is that global marketplace structured by racialized and feminized divisions of labor? And where do we get to the idea that we can sell these things? What thought systems, specifically, what ways of thinking about raced and gendered reproductive bodies need to have been set in place and naturalized in order to make the contemporary market in human life and in vivo labor thinkable? And because it's thinkable, materializable. What makes it a concrete reality? My book begins from the premise that there are two periods in modern history in which the human reproductive body has been engineered for profit. First, during the 400 years of chattel slavery in the Americas, and now in our biocapitalist present. When I refer to biocapitalism, I'm adopting a term that was introduced by scholars in science and technology studies, and they use the term to refer to the forms of capitalism that are involved in the sale and consumption of life itself: stem cells, blood, organs, eggs, sperm, bones, babies, etc. These scientists do great work, but they don't think historically, for the most part, about the forms of commodification that they analyze, and this they don't think about the long history of slavery, especially the long history of slave breeding. By contrast, those who are in slavery studies, and I'm particularly enamored by the work in new slavery studies, including the work by one of our colleagues here on campus, Stephanie Smallwood, these slavery studies scholars, mostly historians, pick up and run with the central claim by the Black Marxist scholar Cedric Robinson, who was the most influential in making the historical case that slavery is a form of capitalism that depends on the racial organization of labor and surplus extraction. But these slavery studies scholars aren't focused on the present. So my work is about reading across these two scholarly conversations, the one on biocapitalism and the contemporary moment, and the one on the slave past, and coming to understand the relationship, therefore, between slavery and our present, slavery and biocapitalism. And I understand this relationship as what I call relationship of historical reciprocity. Slave racial capitalism is retroactively recognizable as a biocapitalist formation. After all, it's predicated on the exploitation of life itself. What was for sale was the human body and all of its processes. Biocapitalism, in turn, is a form of racial capitalism that is, at least proleptically, when we flash forward, recognizable as a form of slavery or slave racial capitalism. So I'm looking at slavery and biocapitalism as sort of intersecting. One is, it takes the form of the other and vice versa. So the question that I began my project with has proliferated, and it proliferated over time, and I've been working on this for far too long. How might attention to the workings of the slave episteme, or what I call the afterlife of slavery in biocapitalism, help us to comprehend our present moment and the various markets in medical, biogenetic, and reproductive technological services and products in which we are all enmeshed? How might we be thinking about slavery in connection to the contemporary reproductive practices that would allow us to more deeply historicize and thus more richly comprehend the exploitation of the reproductive body as a laboring body? And two, how might it help us to imagine a more substantive idea of human freedom, of reproductive freedom, in the face of exploitation by the practices in which we participate and by which we're surrounded? Am I making sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't have slides, I don't have numbers, I'm just trying to communicate, and I'm never sure. Okay. What my research across the disciplines has revealed is that there are few analytical tools, or what I would call heuristic devices, that are available for doing this epistemic thinking about historical continuity that allow us to focus on the racialization and gendering of reproduction and reproductive labor over time. In no small part, this is because the afterlife of slavery, as it pertains to human reproduction, isn't easy to apprehend using available social scientific tools that are grounded in either an express or a residual positivism. Contemporary reproductive laborers are not in any simple sense slaves, and they're certainly not all black women. They may frequently be poor women, and they are increasingly women of color. Think about the surrogate industry in India, in Nepal, Thailand, Mexico, etc. Think of all the donors from the global south and the former Eastern Bloc. But there is no precise analog that leads us to exclaim, wow, black women now, black women then, aha, racial slavery continues. So I want to be totally clear about the nature of this claim. My claim is neither about the racial identity of the individual bodies that are exploited, nor is it about the specific nature of reproductive exploitation. After all, the technologies have changed, as has the mode of production. Slavery and contemporary biocapitalism are different, slave breeding and surrogacy are different. My point is that reproductive processes that take place in vivo, in the female body, fuel contemporary biocapitalism. And the last time in history that this was the case was when enslaved women's reproductive processes fueled what contemporary black studies and Marxist scholars call slave racial capitalism. So there's only 2 times in history when this has happened. In other words, my proposal is that exploitation in the contemporary moment is necessarily racialized and racializing of the reproductive body and the reproductive laborer, because racial slavery is the irrepressible historical and epistemic antecedent or precedent for the contemporary moment. So on the last panel, one of my takeaways, it was a beautiful panel, and I love the confluence across the papers, but I definitely heard the call to deconstruct our ideas of race. So let me be quite clear about what I'm doing. The extension of my argument is that reproduction itself has been and continues to be a race-making process in capitalism. A process that has and continues to produce and recalibrate racial divisions of labor over time. Oh, wow, okay. So the idea of race that I'm dealing with is race as a social construct, but it's actually even more, it's different than that. It's race as a social process, and race as a relationship, and race as a formation, and then on the individual level, it's about race as a process that is transforming and continuous over a lifetime. If we wish to understand the violence of the neoliberal present, we cannot separate the histories of, let me go back. This argument about reproduction as race-making is linked to slave law, and particularly to the notion of partus sequitur ventrum, which was the law under slavery that dictated that the status of the child would follow that of the mother, and reciprocally that the only reproductive laborer, and she wasn't a mother, at least not regarded as one in slavery, who could be forced to reproduce her own kinlessness was the enslaved black woman. In emphasizing the endurance of the slave episteme in biocapitalism, then, I should be clear that I'm not trying to write out the history of colonialism. I regard colonialism and slavery as complexly intersecting, but I'm not going to get into that in this talk. What I'm going to foreground today is the necessity of linking biocapitalism and slavery and privileging this link if we want to get at the centrality of the idea of a racialized reproductive exploitation in our contemporary moment. Just as importantly, and this is the second part of my project, which I might not have time to go into, we must think these two together, biocapitalism and slavery, if we are to liberate ourselves to imagine the forms of women's reproductive resistance that have in the past and yet might yet in the future be possible. Elsewhere, I have discussed this in terms of what the historian Robin Kelley has called Black feminist freedom dreams. My focus has been on the insurgent actions that enslaved women took when they took their reproductive labor power and their products out of circulation, either through infanticide, abortion, contraception, running away, and they produced forms of violent insurgency that challenged slavery. This is Angela Davis, challenged slavery and its reproductive centerpiece, slave breeding. I've treated this in my work as a question of reproductive insurgency that is about women's participation in what W.E.B. Du Bois famously called the general strike against slavery, by which he meant the Civil War, right? The slaves rising up and fighting the Civil War. In developing the argument about slave women's reproductive freedom dreams, I spent a lot of time thinking about the relationship between biocapitalism and slavery, and too, that between slave women's resistance to slavery and what reproductive resistance or justice might look like in the context of contemporary biocapitalism. So much of my thinking on all of this emerges from my longstanding interest in the practice of gestational surrogacy. As I was reading Black feminist legal work on the first surrogacy cases in the 1980s and 90s, for some of you these will be familiar cases, the Baby M case, Johnson v. Calvert. These were cases in which the surrogates refused to turn over the children whom they'd given birth to those with whom they'd gone into contract. In this Black feminist legal scholarship, for the first time I saw scholars linking surrogacy and slavery in really fascinating ways, and I learned from them. As the legal scholar Dorothy Roberts expressed it in her influential book, Killing the Black Body, quote, "It is the enslavement of blacks that enables us to imagine the commodification of human beings, and that makes the vision of fungible breeder women so real." Roberts was then joined by many others who not only recognized Johnson, who was a black woman who gave birth to a white Filipino child, she was likened by the presiding judge in the case to a wet nurse and a foster parent. Those were his enslaving metaphors. And that she was like those before her, being treated like a slave. So at the center of this critique by Black feminists was the idea that surrogates who were losing custody had been legally stripped of their control over their reproductive processes and over the products of their reproductive labors. So this Black feminist critique led me to two more questions, and depending, I may have to end here. One of them was, what would it mean to consider surrogacy itself, the practice, the idea, the philosophical concept, to consider it as a heuristic device that makes visible the historical relationship between slavery and biocapitalism? And then the second question, what would it mean to treat Black feminist theory as a philosophy of history that is keyed to the rise of biocapitalism and neoliberalism, and therefore to the contemporary commodification of racialized and gendered in vivo labor? So to put this in perspective, other scholars of Black feminism have tended not to situate it in this way. They place it in the context of the long civil rights movement, Black power, mainstream white feminism, and occasionally in relation to the women's health movement. So my departure has been to read Black feminism as a philosophical formation that is actually keyed to its moment of production, that gives us the tools we need to understand